Good morning and happy Easter. The message this morning, I'll be sharing the story of Jesus' resurrection from the Gospel of John, found in chapter 20. And then during live worship in the sanctuary this Easter Sunday, my sermon will be in three parts, three brief reflections interspersed with verses of the hymn In the Garden. And the lyrics of that hymn, well, the music and lyrics, were both written by Austin Miles. And so I will share a reflection. The congregation will sing. Those will go back and forth. But what I'll be doing in this recorded message is reading you the lyrics of the verse and then providing the reflection so that you will still be able to hear that connection. There are lots of YouTube recordings of In the Garden, so I hope that you'll check out one of those. So here now, the proclamation of our Lord's resurrection according to John. Early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the tomb. So she ran and went to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved, and said to them, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they have laid him." Then Peter and the other disciple set out and went toward the tomb. The two were running together, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. He bent down to look in and saw the linen wrappings lying there, but he did not go inside. Then Simon Peter came, following him, and went into the tomb. He saw the linen wrappings lying there, and the cloth that had been on Jesus's head, not lying with the linen wrappings, but rolled up in a place all by itself. Then the other disciple, who'd reached the tomb first, also went in, and he saw and believed. For as yet they did not understand the scripture that Jesus must rise from the dead. Then the disciples returned to their homes. But Mary stood weeping outside the tomb, and as she bent over to look into the tomb, she saw two angels in white, sitting where the body of Jesus had been lying, one at the head and one at the feet. They said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" She said to them, "They've taken away my Lord. I do not know where they have laid him." When she had said this, she turned around and she saw Jesus standing there, but she didn't know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping? Who are you looking for?" Now, supposing him to be the gardener, she said to him, "Sir, if you have carried him away, just tell me where you've laid him, and I will take him away." Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned to him and said in Hebrew, "Rabboni," which means teacher. Jesus said to her, "Do not hold on to me, because I have not yet ascended to the Father, but go to my brothers and say to them, I am ascending to my God and your God, to my Father and your Father." So Mary Magdalene went and she announced to the disciples, "I have seen the Lord." And she told them the things that Jesus had said to her. Hear this, the first verse of the Miles hymn, In the Garden. I come to the garden alone while the dew is still on the roses, and the voice I hear falling on my ear, the Son of God discloses. And he walks with me, and he talks with me, and he tells me I am his own. And the joy we share as we tarry there, none other has ever known. Today, as Christians, we associate Easter morning with joy, but the first Easter didn't start out very joyously. It started in darkness and weighed down with grief. Now, it's understandable that Mary came to the tomb that morning to grieve. Passover had just ended. Now, exposure to a corpse, to a dead body, that would render someone unclean. And if someone was unclean, they were unable to participate in a Jewish festival or feast like Passover. So this would have been Mary's first opportunity to visit Jesus's grave. Now, I imagine that had Jesus not risen from the dead, that Mary would have behaved much the same as we do today when we go to the grave of a loved one. We sit quietly. Often we weep. We may even talk to them. We know that our loved one is dead, and yet we still want to be in the place of their final rest. It somehow helps us feel closer to them. Our hearts are so heavy when we grieve. So that first Easter began with this terrible, crushing grief and sadness. And when Mary discovers that Jesus's body is no longer in the tomb, I mean, that's just insult to injury, right? I mean, can we even begin to imagine how upset that must have made her, how desperate and bereft she must have felt? And that is her emotional state when Jesus appears to her. I read one Bible scholar this week that pointed out that in John's gospel, everyone to whom the risen Jesus appears is in a what we would label as a negative state or condition, right? I mean, Mary is crushed with grief and sadness. The disciples are in the upper room behind locked doors because they are terrified of the authorities. Thomas is just riddled with doubt and cynicism. And the disciples fishing overnight are abject failures as they return to their formal occupation. I mean, they'd thrown in their nets when Jesus called them, but now when they pick them back up, well, it appears that those 3 years in itinerant rabbinical school must have wrecked their casting arm. Grief, fear, doubt, failure, those are the context into which Jesus comes to make his risen, death-defying presence known to those who love him. Our hymn writer's poetic image of dew on morning roses, that sounds beautiful, doesn't it? But if there really was any dew to be found on morning roses, I don't know how lovely Mary would have found it. I imagine she had a reddened, runny nose and puffy, bloodshot eyes from crying herself to sleep the night before. See, the voice of God's Son doesn't just call out to the happy, the courageous, the confident, the successful. So wherever you are on the emotional map this Easter, whatever condition in which you find yourself, Jesus still wants to walk with you and talk with you and tell you, assure you that you are his own. Here now, verse 2 of the hymn in the garden. He speaks, and the sound of his voice is so sweet. The birds hush their singing. And the melody that he gave to me within my heart is ringing. And he walks with me, and he talks with me, and he tells me I am his own. And the joy we share as we tarry there, none other has ever known. There is just something about the way that some people say our names, isn't there? Names are so personal, so intimate. If you think about it, they're probably the only thing that we own through the entirety of our lives, from the womb to the grave, right? In the 10th chapter of John's Gospel, Jesus names himself as the Good Shepherd, and this is what he says. The one who enters by the gate is the shepherd of the sheep. The sheep hear his voice. He calls his sheep by name and leads them out, and the sheep follow him because they know his voice. They will not follow a stranger because they do not know the voice of strangers. Friends, Jesus is a good shepherd who calls his sheep by name, and they recognize his voice. There have been times in my life when I've felt lonely, and one of the things that helped me when I feel lonely, when I feel a bit forsaken, when I move, for example, to a new place and feel like I'm far from the people who know and love me, one of the things that I do is I kind of hear in my mind the way that those who love me say my name. And there's something about the recollection of their voices saying my name. It brings me comfort. But the speaking of our names does more than that, right? It gives us a sense of belonging also. Jesus, again in that 10th chapter of John, he says that there will be one flock with one shepherd. When Jesus speaks our name, he calls us into the fold, a place of security and comfort and belonging. He speaks, and the sound of his voice is so sweet. Listen. Can you hear him? Right here and now, speaking your name. He speaks your name and tells you you are his own, a sheep of his fold, a lamb of his flock. Hear this final verse of Miles' hymn in the garden. I'd stay in the garden with him, though the night around me be falling, but he bids me go through the voice of woe. His voice to me is calling. And he walks with me, and he talks with me, and he tells me I am his own. And the joy we share as we tarry there, none other has ever known. Once Mary recognizes Jesus, I imagine she would have given anything for time to just freeze, right? For the opportunity to just stay there in the garden with Jesus, her teacher, her friend. But Jesus has a job for Mary to do. She is the one who is to go and tell, to give the disciples the good news that he is risen, just as he said he would. Perhaps you've never before considered the fact that Mary was an enormously unlikely person, an unlikely candidate for this assignment. She's a woman. And in the first century Palestinian world, women weren't permitted to give witness or testimony. Their witness wasn't considered trustworthy. We get a sense of this in the Gospel of Luke. When the women at the tomb to whom Jesus appears, they run and they tell the disciples, and we're told that to the disciples, their witness appears to be an idle tale. How demeaning. Like we would scold a little child and say, now don't tell tall tales, right? Mary was living in a man's world. Women were little more than property, incubators for a man's progeny. Yet in all four Gospels, women are the first to witness the resurrection. The church began, my friends, with the eyewitness of a woman. I have seen the Lord, Mary said. Go and tell is the mission that Jesus entrusts to her. I wonder, where have you experienced the presence of Jesus, the risen Lord, in your life, and to whom have you given witness? Now, maybe you don't feel like a very good candidate for the task. Maybe you think that job would be better left to the religious professionals. But Mary was about as far from a religious professional as you could get. Friends, where and to whom can you go and tell the good news that you have seen the Lord? I mean, that you've experienced his presence. It's a wonderful thing if you can sense God's presence during times of worship or prayer, singing even as you're out walking in nature. It's wonderful. I'm so happy for you if you can feel, if you can sense God's presence. But Jesus didn't allow Mary to just linger in the garden, just the two of them, indefinitely, much as she might have wanted to. The news of his resurrection is just too important. It was her mission to go and tell the good news. I have seen the Lord. And that's our mission too. So go and tell.